Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a seriously fascinating analysis of American legal history and biblical theology. We are going to dive deep into the foundational ideas that literally built the United States, how those ideals sometimes totally clashed with the legal realities on the ground, and what the source material suggests about charting an honest path forward for historical justice.
So, if America completely rejected the absolute rule of a king, why in the world did it keep the king's tools of conquest? Well, that's exactly the provocative tension we're exploring today. The American legal order famously declared that rights come from the Creator and that government only exists by the consent of the governed. It was a massive rejection of hereditary rule. But, as the sources point out, America didn't fully escape the legal inheritance of conquest, racial subordination, or sovereign claims over land. How did a nation born out of a desire for liberty end up using the very tools of empire it tried to leave behind?
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll cover 1. The American legal contradiction. 2. Who owns the earth? 3. Conquest by legal doctrine. 4. Subordination and civil identity. And finally 5. The architecture of restoration.
All right, Section 1. The American legal contradiction.
This is a foundational paradox at the very heart of the American legal system. On one hand, you've got these incredible founding ideals, the Declaration of Independence shouting that all men are created equal with unalienable rights. But on the other hand, you have the quiet, simultaneous adoption of European imperial land doctrines. The sources emphasize that we can't just ignore this contradiction. Actually, we have to test American institutions against the very standard they loudly proclaimed.
Moving on to Section 2. Who owns the earth?
Now, to really understand the sources' critique here, we first need to establish their biblical baseline, because if you want to understand where American law went off track, you kind of have to understand the higher jurisdiction it claimed to appeal to. Under this biblical framework, all civil authority and property are actually limited trusts. The earth belongs to God, and Christ is king. Man is granted dominion, sure, but that dominion isn't absolute independent ownership. It's essentially a fiduciary duty, a subordinate stewardship.
So here is the critical contrast. Biblical law treats land as an entrusted stewardship, but American common law, it evolved to treat it as absolute title administered by a sovereign. The authors argue that just because the people kicked out the British crown, it didn't mean they suddenly became this unlimited collective king. Civil authority and property are always supposed to remain limited trusts.
Which brings us to Section 3, Conquest by Legal Doctrine.
Let's see how this idea of absolute civil sovereignty actually played out in early American courts. The analysis points directly to the doctrine of discovery. It basically meant that whichever European Christian nation discovered land instantly gained exclusive ultimate title to it, reducing the indigenous populations already living there to just mere occupants. It's pretty astonishing when you think about it. This medieval tool of empire literally became the legal mechanism for dispossession in a republic. Look at how this timeline unfolded. In 1776, we have the Declaration of Independence, but then jump to 1823, and Chief Justice John Marshall formalizes this discovery doctrine into U.S. common law with the Johnson versus McIntosh decision. Think about that for a second. The newly formed nation rejected a king, but its highest court still used the king's legal tools to claim underlying sovereign title to the land. The doctrine didn't invent dispossession, but it built the legal architecture for it.
All right, Section 4, Subordination and civil identity.
This framework of subordination wasn't just about land. It was applied directly to human civil identity. The sources map out a really disturbing pattern here. African Americans were systematically denied fundamental legal personality, stripped of liberty, family security, and property capacity. In 1857, the Dred Scott decision explicitly denied federal citizenship to persons of African descent. It literally took the Reconstruction Amendments in the 1860s to even attempt a structural correction of this massive legal injury.
The authors make a huge point here. While civil systems naturally classify people for everyday governance, like defining who is a citizen or a resident, that classification must never, ever override the ontological reality of personhood established by the Creator. The state doesn't create man. When civil law treats human beings as property, it vastly oversteps its delegated authority.
And that brings us to our final section, number 5, the architecture of restoration.
So how do we lawfully repair these historical injuries today? The sources propose that true restoration should mirror the biblical concept of jubilee.
Now, Jubilee wasn't just some abstract, feel-good apology. It was a codified statute. It involved the actual return of ancestral land and releasing people from debt servitude. It operated as a lawful, concrete reset within an earthly jurisdiction to protect inheritance.
And this right here is the absolute core of the argument. African American restoration has to rest on truth, identifiable injury, and lawful restitution. It cannot just be an exercise in institutional absolution. The sources strongly warn against creating an economy of inherited guilt where ancestry just becomes proof of perpetual victimhood or guilt. Because justice without truth, it just becomes political punishment.
So what does honest, earthly restitution actually look like? Well, it's a strict legal process. You can't just claim colonialism was bad in the abstract and call it a day. You have to identify specific wrongful acts, pinpoint the responsible parties, identify the injured party, measure the exact loss, and then administer a proportionate remedy.
Instead of just throwing around blanket racial guilt, the sources argue a serious claim focuses on actionable legal remedies, exactly like these. Returning unlawfully seized land, for example. A deed might be legally recorded, but if it originated in theft, the law can restore that property. It's about honest accounting where personhood, property, and equal protection were historically denied.
The crucial takeaway here is that while we absolutely must rigorously pursue earthly justice, no human commission can sell absolution or replace spiritual redemption. The sources are incredibly definitive on this. Political payment cannot redeem a soul. Lawful reparation is strictly about addressing a temporal wrong within an earthly jurisdiction, not trying to replicate the judgment seat of Christ.
So I'm going to leave you with this provocative question to chew on. Can historical justice actually be achieved through institutional guilt, or does it require honest, identifiable restitution? The source material really challenges us to measure America against the very standard it invoked. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep asking those hard questions.